Guys, it's your favorite actor, Senpai Reacts, and the day has finally come. n.SSign Love, Love, Love music video officially dropped this morning, and we finally gonna react to it. Before any day, make sure you like this video. Let's get this video to 1,000 likes today, and make sure you subscribe if you new, and comment below any video suggestions you have. So excited! Let's jump straight into the video.
첫눈에 반한 느낌이 뭔지 이제야 나 알고만 같아 특별한 감정인걸 예전과는 달라 흑백이던 내 일상 속 네가 나타났지고 온 세상이 colorful 가이나 on you 실월 가득히 너는 날 물들여 세상에 빛나는 것들은 다 전부 널 비추는 어둠이야 Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you up in the sky show you love 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 Only you 둘이서 always 함께해 Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you up in the sky I'll show you love 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 온 세상이 다 너로 빛나 and I love it yeah
She
온통 너야 you're my universe Look what I found 우리 둘은 다른 점도 많아 짜릿해 새로운 날 특별한 세상 탐험하듯이 Never see someone like you
I like the pink colorway
행복이
in this video.
뭐라고 묻는다면 주저없이 난 널 답할 거야 Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky I show you love 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 Only you 둘이서 always 함께해 Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky I show you love 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 온 세상이 다 너로 빛나 and I love it yeah 온통 너야 you're my universe One two 셀 수 없지 Oh yeah 너와 나 함께할 시간 앞으로도 이어가자 Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky I'll show you love 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 Only you 둘이서 always 함께해 Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky I'll show you love 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 온 세상이 다 너로 빛나 and I love it yeah 온통 너야 you're my universe
Fire, amazing. I know I was gonna like this video. So let's go back to him. I like the art. I like the art style and like the colorway. Like it's real bright, like with the yellow, pink, and like the blue background.
그만 같아 특별한 감정인걸 예전과는 달라 흑백이던 내 일상 속 네가 나타났지고 온 세상이 colorful 가이나 on you 실월
She
가득히 너는 날 물들여 세상에 빛나는 것들은 다 전부 널 비추는 어둠이야 Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky show you
what is does anybody know the meaning of the sheep? Let me know in the comment section. Like what's the why is there so many sheep? Why is there so many sheep?
love 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 Only you 둘이서 always 함께해 Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky I'll show you love love
I can't wait to watch the behind the scenes video for this thing. Cause I assume like they just jumping on a trampoline and just like doing moves. So I can't wait to see the behind the scenes for this video.
love 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 universe. Look what I found. 우리 둘은 다른 점도 많아. 짜릿해 새로운 늘 특별한 세상 탐험하듯이. Never seen someone like you before. 행복이 뭐냐고 묻는다면 주저없이 난 널 답할 거야. Stay with me 날 향해 뛰는 나는 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I show you love, 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 love. Only you 둘이서 always 함께해. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I show you love, 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 love. 온 세상이 다 너로 빛나 and I love it, yeah. 온통 너야, you're my universe. One, two, 셀 수 없지. Oh yeah. 너와 나 함께할 시간 앞으로도 이어가자. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I show you love, 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 love. Oh, love. Only you 둘이서 always 함께해. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I show you love, 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 love. 온 세상이 다 너로 빛나 and I love it, yeah. 온통 너야, you're my universe.
All right, that was n.SSign Love, Love, Love official music video. 1 million out of 10. I know I was gonna like this video because I like every other video. This is an amazing group. I really love n.SSign. Make sure you guys like the video. Let's get this video to 1 million. Or let's try 1,000 likes. Let's see 1,000. Then if it gets to 1 million, hey, I'll be happy. But if you're new, make sure you subscribe, share the video, comment below your favorite song. If you have any video suggestions, let me know in the comment section. It's your favorite reactor, Senpai Reacts, and I see you guys in the next video.